All right, everybody, welcome. Welcome to the kickoff meeting for the new season of AAAP. And it's so great to be here and renew our togetherness and our commitment to astronomy and sharing our knowledge and sharing our joy with the night sky. We have a few announcements I want to go through, and then very quickly I'll turn it over to Victor and he'll introduce our speakers tonight. We're doing something pretty special tonight with our lineup of speakers, so you'll hear more about that in a moment. We'll take a brief intermission after the talks are done, and we'll come back, and there are some things that we're doing in the club observationally and otherwise, and I want to toss out the Lunar South Pole Challenge. I'll describe that a little bit here. But there's a write-up in the Sidereal Times this month if you're interested in pursuing that a little bit more. Or stay tuned. The biggest announcement, I think, is that we have accepted an invitation to return to Princeton University campus to the esteemed Peyton Hall, home of the Astrophysical Sciences Department, and our home as an astronomy club for the last so many years, beyond count almost. Until COVID interrupted, we had decades of repeat meetings at that location. And then, of course, we've been vagabonds in the world of Zoom for the last 2.5 years. And so it's my great pleasure to say that we've had some dialogue, some conversation with the powers that be in the department, and they are welcoming us back. This is a view of Peyton Hall coming from the campus side, the other side from Ivy Lane, I guess it would be southeast direction, walking up. And I'm showing you this because you want to get used to it. We won't be able to access from our old parking lots, and the Ivy Lane approach is, of course, under massive reconstruction. I think everybody is generally aware of that. That will change things a great deal for us. And we can talk about this later. I don't want to go into maps and so forth right now, but perhaps after the break, and certainly there'll be a time because we won't be able to convene for at least a couple more months. Right now, the preliminary target is to convene a meeting on premises of the campus on the November, the second Tuesday in November meeting. That remains to be seen. We have a few kinks to work out, but if at all possible, we aim to produce our meetings hybrid, if you will, going forward, where we'll be Zooming the proceedings from the auditorium there at Peyton Hall. And that will allow our members to make the choice of whether you want to get together in person or whether it's better for you to stay home. Of course, we're going to be trying to twist your arm to come out, but that remains to be seen exactly how it's all going to work out for everybody. I will remind you that, excuse me, indeed. Peyton Hall, or more correctly, the university, the policy is very clear. They have that published on their website, of course, and you can refer to it. But they are requiring that everybody that comes on the campus, so that would include us going to our meetings at Peyton Hall, will be vaccinated fully for the COVID virus. And if you are not vaccinated, you are expected to have had a COVID test within a day or 3 days, depending on the nature of the test. So long story short is we will make some decisions internally on whether we're going to monitor. Perhaps we don't need to monitor our own members, but rather take it as faith that if you turn up for the meeting, you will indeed have good vaccination status. So more to be said about that in the next meeting, and we'll be preparing for our return to Peyton, but it's fantastic news, and it's a long time coming, so we'll see how things work out. The other thing that is a really big event for us in terms of accomplishing a long stated goal is that, you remember I showed this slide about 2.5 years ago when we first went into the Zooming thing, and we were struggling with the idea we need to get a reconstruction project accomplished despite the issues, the slowness of getting the permits necessary from the state and the state park administration and all the issues behind finding a really good construction company. Well, this is then, and this is now. Over the last year and a half, we've had contributions from no less than 37 participants, club members to the Observatory Reconstruction Fund. So here's a really big thank you to all of you who opened your checkbooks to help support this project. Here is the observatory columns today. A brilliant, pristine white overcoating of these concrete masonry units. We found a really, really good mason, CWC Masonry out of Trenton, local talent. And those of us who met Carl realize he's a character, and he was informing us that he believes he is the only remaining 5th generation Italian masonry company left in the United States. And they did a fine job. So we are back up to full operational mode. And of course, many of you have been out there, but if you haven't, make sure you get out this fall. Just to keep things moving here, I wanted to also announce that this fall we are focusing on the 60th anniversary of our club. And indeed, it has been 60 years since we incorporated in the early years of the space race. We incorporated as a nonprofit, and we have met nearly every month, at least in the academic season, without fail ever since, which is kind of remarkable when you think about it. So now is the time to decide what we're going to do to mark this momentous situation, 60th anniversary. What shall we do? And there's some ideas that are starting to percolate, but we would love to get some input from our membership. And if you have an idea on what we can do, it can be an event, it can be a thing, it can be a commemorative, I don't know, rocket, it can be anything. But send your ideas on a 60th celebration event to the editors at princetonastronomy.org. That's where we send our articles for the Sidereal Times. And you're welcome to send it in, and we'll be considering these and trying to come up with a scheme of how we can do better than just showing a slide at a September meeting to mark the 60th anniversary of AAAP. Righto, we can come back to this after the break as well. Last thing I want to mention, I'm sure many of you, like me, were sort of nervously watching your television screen a week ago, getting ready for the Artemis first launch of the SLS, and it didn't happen yet, but it is being worked on, and we hope that the problems will be solved, and maybe yet near the end of September, we'll see the launch. This, of course, brings up a very interesting topic for us to be considering, and that is the moon, and why are we going back to the moon, and what's this all about? And this is an artist's rendition, of course, of a future landing under the Artemis program in a crater which is meant to depict perhaps the South Polar region, maybe the Shackleton crater, where ice is being discovered. And there's a big to-do about this that I want to get into. Perhaps after the break would be a better time, but I'm announcing right now the AAAP Lunar South Pole Region Observing Challenge. And this could be a very difficult thing. Don't get lulled into thinking observing the moon is simple. It is not. In fact, there's reason to think that there are very few legitimate pictures that have captured from observers on Earth the South Pole craters of the moon. So, okay, enough of this. I'm going to stop here. I'm going to hand it over to Victor, and we're going to have our main program, and I'll be talking to you guys again after the break.
First speaker tonight is Dr. Michael DeMario. He is founder and CEO of Astrum Systems, which we'll mention in a minute. And his program's titled Pluto, Pre-Covery and the Resurrection of Yerkes Observatory. The dwarf planet Pluto was famously discovered by Clyde Tombaugh in 1930. Using photographic plates he exposed at Lowell Observatory near Flagstaff, Arizona. Now, knowing that where the planet is on these plates, could pre-1930 images have revealed Pluto? It turns out that the answer is yes. It's been pre-covered 14 times. The earliest images taken on January 23rd, 1914 at the Königstuhl Observatory. I'm lucky if I got that right, in Heidelberg, Germany. More recently, and to our topic, an even earlier pre-covery was accomplished at the University of Chicago Yerkes Observatory. Members of the Asteroid Search and Studies by amateurs at Yerkes Group, acronym ASSAY, a function of Yerkes outreach program, made a pre-covery of Pluto on 2 photographic plates dated August 20 and November 11th, 1909. Pluto orbits the sun once every 248.5 Earth years at a mean distance of 39.53 astronomical units. Since its discovery in 1930, Pluto has only traversed 27% of its orbit. The 1909 recovery increases the observed orbit to 36%. Dr. DeMario will discuss the recovery process and its significance. He'll also discuss the status of Yerkes Observatory's revitalization. A few words about our guest speaker. Michael DeMario, PhD, is the founder and CEO of Astrum Systems, a global consulting venture focused on employing systems engineering methodologies in early research and development. He's also actively engaged in creating a blog highlighting large and university-based observatories, including solar and RF telescopes. He holds a PhD in systems engineering, MBA in management of technology, MS in computer engineering, and significant coursework in space science. He's president of Astrum Systems, a technology management consulting firm, and co-chairs the INCOS Early Systems Engineering and Research Working Group. And as we learned earlier, he holds an amateur radio extra class license, and his call sign is K2MJD. And with that, thank you, Dr. DeMario.
Thanks, Victor. Let me try to go sharing my screen here. And if I can do this right.
Yes.
Yeah, got it.
Great.
Is that better?
That's perfect.
Okay. So the title is slightly changed. It's Pluto Recovery at Yerkes Observatory. The resurrection of Yerkes. I have one chart on that, and I had to cut it back because the talk got way too long. And Yerkes is on a huge. I'll talk about it a little bit later, but it's on a big revitalization, which I couldn't do Pluto Recovery and talk about the revitalization all in one talk. I do have another talk that I'd be happy to give at some later time on Yerkes and its revitalization. But it's going through a $25 million revitalization. So let's talk about the recovery. And before I forget, if you want to see a really good movie that actually uses Yerkes Observatory, it is the movie called Chain Reaction, and it was put out in 1996 with Keanu Reeves and Morgan Freeman and Rachel Weisz. And Yerkes is the center of the movie towards the latter half of the movie. So really good, fast flick. I won't give you the plot, but if you want to see Yerkes used in a lot of Yerkes used in a movie prop, see Chain Reaction. All right. Okay, so the agenda. I'll talk a little bit about Pluto. I don't know how many folks really know a lot about Pluto. Some folks know a lot. About 3 charts on Pluto itself, and then talk about the Pluto recovery of 1909, and I have one chart on the revitalization of Pluto. Okay, so brief history of Pluto. As was already mentioned, it was discovered by Clyde Tombaugh. He used a 13-inch refractor. And he was actually hired as an assistant to look for Lowell's predicted 1915 Planet X. I mean, even at that time, they knew that there was another force out there that were perturbing the planets. And so Tombaugh discovered it on February 18, 1930, even though he took the photograph in January. So it took him a good month to using a Zeiss blink comparator to actually look at as 14-inch by 17-inch glass plates. Of course, he's looking at, of course, these glass plates held anywhere from 50,000 to 900,000 stars. And you can just imagine sitting there all day long using a blink comparator to look for something that might have moved among objects that are 50,000, 900,000 stars. I mean, I would go blind. So I don't know how he was able to pull that off, but it's quite a feat. And of course, it was 15th magnitude at that time, and it was the constellation Gemini. What's even more interesting is how Pluto was actually named. It was actually named by a girl in England, an 11-year-old schoolgirl by the name of Venetia Burney Fair. And the reason why she was able to name it is because her great uncle, who was Henry Madden, named Mars moons Phobos and Deimos. So he had a direct network in to the leading observatories in the United States as far as discoveries and what to name them. Of course, she was studying in her current classwork. She was actually studying Pluto and those types of characters, and so she thought Pluto was the very good name for this object. She was actually 90 years old when she passed away. She passed away in 2009. What's even more interesting is that New Horizons spacecraft, which went to Pluto, had a dust collector that was actually named after her, called the Venetia. It was so she got some recognition for naming Pluto. It also got passed through because even though Percival Lowell had already passed away at this time, it was named PL, which then got greater acceptance because folks felt that it stood for Percival Lowell. But if you think about Pluto, though, one orbit is 248 years, right? So if you do the math, 248 minus 2022, so one orbit ago, as of today, right? You're looking at the first Continental Congress in Philadelphia, the first Continental Congress adjourned out of Philly. American Revolutionary War, the Kingdom of Great Britain orders the port of Boston, Massachusetts closed because of the Boston Port Act. And of course, Marie Antoinette and Louis the Sixth become King and Queen of France. So just think about 248 years ago, right? So one orbit. It's sort of, at least in my mind, it's a bit humbling. Now, Pluto was always a mystery, of course, until the New Horizons spacecraft went by. Now, I'll talk about the previous mission, which our work was actually used for, but given it's so far away, 39 astronomical units, it takes 5.5 hours for radio frequency or light for us to actually receive Pluto's light. But Pluto is small. It's only 1,473 miles in diameter, and its largest moon, which is Charon, is 750. But they're both locked. They're both in a very tight tidal lock. Now, what's interesting, because they are so close, the center of mass of Pluto is actually 700 miles above its surface towards the direction of Charon, because they're only 12,000 miles apart. So they are very, very close. And based upon the New Horizons spacecraft, they now believe that Charon had been a part of Pluto and had split off. And of course, because they're so close, Charon actually shares material with Pluto. So Pluto's is actually streaming material off of Charon's surface. Now, Pluto's demise, which is really interesting, why did Pluto why was it deplaneted? So the whole understanding of the Kuiper belt began in the 1990s. And so more objects were being discovered in the 1990s. And so now it became a discussion as to what really classifies a planet versus everything else that they're starting to discover. Then an interesting event took place in February of 2000. Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson, who just I think he was the Hayden Planetarium director only for a few months. They put up a new exhibit at the planetarium, and the exhibit excluded Pluto. So they didn't come out and make any bold statements. All they did was they didn't include Pluto in the solar system in the exhibit of the solar system. And so that took a lot of folks' attention. Now, if you watch latest Big Bang, right? So Big Bang, Neil Dr. Tyson has been on Big Bang. He actually goes out and says right on the show, right, on the series that he's the reason why Pluto is no longer a planet. So he really admits it on the Big Bang. But that's what actually started, was in February of 2000. Then in 2005, Caltech found Eris, and Eris, when they found Eris, it was the 9th most massive object circling the sun. And so then they proposed it as the 10th planet. And of course, in proposing it as the 10th planet, then of course the International Astronomical Unit, goes, oh, wait a minute, folks, let's slow things down. Let's take a look at this. So that was January 2005. August of 2006, then the Prague International Astronomical Unit meets. And so then they define what a planet is. So there's 3 main categories that make up a planet. That's found in resolution 5A. 1, it must orbit the sun. Number 2, has to be massive enough whereby it is round. In other words, its gravity makes it round, makes it spherical. And then 3, that object must clear its neighborhood about its orbit. This is where Pluto was no longer a planet, because Pluto had not cleared its orbit, thus the Kuiper belt. So this is the primary reason why Pluto is not a planet, is because it did not clear its other objects out of its orbit. And of course, then resolution 6A says, Pluto is a dwarf planet, and we love Pluto, and we're going to make it a prototype of a new category of trans-Neptunian objects. And so Pluto still gets a good spot, but of course, we all love Pluto and as a planet, and it's no longer a planet. Okay, let's talk about the pre-covering. All right, so the pre-covering, what ASSAY is. So ASSAY, the group of amateur astronomers, mostly all engineers of some skill set, electrical engineers, software engineers, systems engineers, optical engineers, laser engineer, all different walks of life, mostly from the high-tech companies of Motorola, is in Schaumburg, Illinois, Lucent Bell Labs, which is in Naperville. And so a lot of the folks came from the northern Chicago high-tech companies. And so we were called the ASSAY Group. Our main mission was to create technology using early adaptive optics at that time, using some of it was the early SBIG cameras, but the mission was NEOs, so near Earth objects, was to create techniques whereby we can locate and track near Earth objects. And so that was the mission. However, the problem was, this is Wisconsin. So Williams Bay, so Yerkes Observatory is located in Williams Bay, Wisconsin, just on the north side of Lake Geneva, if anyone's ever been there. Great vacation spot in the summer. A lot of the Chicago folks go up to Lake Geneva. for vacation, big lake, water sports. And Yerkes sits above the lake on the north side. But it is Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, you have winter, and in winter you have a lot of clouds. And so we spent a lot of time not doing observatory, not doing observing, or working with the early adaptive cameras. We did a lot of work working at glass plates and the library and going to the bar. Walter Wild, the individual on the left, he's the one who actually proposed and started the assay. He felt that there was wide talent out there in the community that would gladly volunteer their time. He was very selective as to who joined assay, and so he led the team. He was a professor at University of Chicago, astrophysics. Sadly, he passed away from a cardiac event in 1999, giving a lecture at University of Chicago. However, the plates, there's two pictures of two of the plates there. The one on the left is one of our plates. The one on the right was a 10 by 10. It turned out to be not one of our plates, even though we think it has Pluto, but we could not verify it. And of course, our office is on the far right there. We were below one of the smaller domes, and of course, our offices were always curved because they curved the walls. Okay, so we ended up looking at hundreds of plates, if not maybe even 1,000. Yerkes Observatory currently houses one of the largest photographic glass plate archives on the planet. There's got to be maybe close to 100,000 plates, and they're so fragile that they cannot be moved. If you can imagine glass plates with an emulsion film on them since about 1897 through about 1930. And of course, they're all stored in metal cabinets. And if you can imagine all these plates leaning up against one another and the end plates actually crumbling and being cracked because of the weight of all these plates leaning against the end plates. And so there's a lot of broken plates. The emulsion on them is peeling off. That was part of our challenge, as well as the photographic grains. The grains themselves are larger than Pluto. They are larger than a magnitude 15 or 16 star. So to be able to identify any object that is of that magnitude among photographic grains turned out to be quite challenging. So what we did was we actually compared it against the Palomar plates, which were the National Geographic Palomar Sky Survey plates. And we also used at the time, today, this is back in 1998. Today, there is a great deal of software available. Back then, the only software that we had available that was even remotely dependable was Megastar, if any of you remember Megastar. So we actually hold the record. So the two arrows there at the upper right, at the top, 1909, August 20th, 1909, November 11th, 1909, as the RA index. And of course, we found that at Yerkes, the data on top is the distance and the magnitude by which it was actually discovered at, or actually photographed at. Frankie Ross, the guy on the right, he actually found one, which was January 29th, 1921, as well as another one, which he had taken January 6th, 1927. So there's two more than below on Yerkes. Ross was an interesting character. He was originally with Kodak, and he was hired to replace Barnard. And so the plates that were exposed on January of 1921 by Barnard in January 1927 by himself. Actually had Pluto. Ross was a wide field photography expert with an interest in celestial mechanics, but he's also what his main credit is he is the inventor of multi-element lenses. So up to this time, multi-element lenses did not exist, and Ross came in and actually invented them while still an employee of Kodak, and that's why he was actually hired by Yerkes. He actually retired from Yerkes in 1939, and so he's credited with doing a great deal of work at Yerkes in replacing Barnard. These are Barnard's actual notes, and the arrows are the notes that of his glass plate, of the two glass plates that we actually focused on. If you look at his writings, though, in the notes section, he was actually looking for Halley's Comet. He was very noted in spending a great deal of time in hunting for comets. And at this particular time of the year in 1909, he was actively looking for Halley's Comet. And so every night, as much as possible that he could do given the Wisconsin weather, he was looking for Halley's Comet, and you can see that in his notes. He used a Bruce. It's called a Bruce 10-inch astrograph. Picture of it is on the right. In fact, I had to dig this out of the Chicago University of Chicago archives. Folks at Yerkes had not even seen a picture of that when they reviewed this talk a month ago. So actually, some of the photographs in this package, Yerkes had never seen before, and they want to be using them. I'm trying to rush through here for my lot of time. So here are two pictures of the two plates. You can, of course, the photographs don't do them justice because it's really hard to see as a photograph, and that's why we had to use stereo microscopes to actually look at it and be able to see the grains versus a possible Pluto. There were emulsion cracks. The emulsion was peeling, but these two plates, 6B556 and 583, were two Barnard plates. They're both 6-inch plates that actually hold Pluto, and is actually in a separate now area of Yerkes, whereby they actually have these two plates on exhibit at Yerkes now, because this has been confirmed. So when we first did this back in 1998, 1997, 1998, it was really difficult getting observatories like University of Wisconsin to actually, and University of Chicago to actually confirm it. Sadly, the initial feedback was, well, it can't be true because a bunch of amateurs found it. That was a first knee-jerk reaction. Then I'll get into how that story changed, but it was really difficult at that time to get confirmation, even though we spent about 9 months trying to confirm this and confirm it against other plates as well as the Palomar plates. The left is off the Yerkes site now. So if you go to the Yerkes website under Legacy, on the Legacy tab, you see the picture on the left. So what Yerkes did was they took one of the plates, and I don't know which one this one is actually. I couldn't communicate with them to figure that out. And I don't think they actually knew, but they actually defocused the plate to bring up Pluto, which is a little red circle. So they actually defocused everything, all the objects, to be able to bring that out. And I don't know exactly how they actually did that. And that's Barnard on the left. And on the right was Barnard's personal observatory with the Bruce telescope in April 16, 1904. Barnard actually took that picture himself. And I got that out of the U of C archive library as well. You see Lake Michigan off in the distance. So Yerkes property does sit high above Lake Geneva. It looks down onto the lake. Yerkes property was at this time was 53 acres, mostly all woods. Today it's 50 acres. So they moved off 3 acres. But this is on Yerkes actually talks about this now on their website. Okay, this is the transition. So Pluto of August 20th, 1909, transitions in Taurus over to the right in November 12th. And if you notice the asterisms, right? So keep in mind those three little asterisms on the top of August 20th, and what the asterisms look like below November 12th there, because you'll be seeing those again. Okay, so these are 4 pictures of two different plates, 6556 and 583. Now the goal here was to show that it moved. So if you look on the left-hand side, on the far left plate, that's 6B556 plate, August 20th of 1909. So that little smudge, that's really hard. Again, I apologize. It's really hard to see without a stereo microscope. But the little smudge there is Pluto on August 20th, and right below those three close asterisms. Now the goal is to show that it moves. So then you go over to November 11th, 6B583, the one on the right, November 11th, is not there, right? Because on this plate, it moved. It's over on the plate on the left. Now, if you go over to August 20th, 6B556, the other plate, it's not there. And if you go over the far right on November 11th, 6B583, it's actually there. So it actually moved from August 20th plate over to the November 11th plate. But you had to show that it actually moved. So you have to show, so we had to show where it wasn't then on November 11th and August 20th on those respective plates. So that was part of our challenge. That's where the bulk of the time went, was to actually show that it actually was there and moved in the process of peeling plates and the very large photographic reams. Of course, it took other folks just as long, just trying to verify. So what's the significance? So the significance was we showed that at this time, 1997, 1998, a lot of attention wasn't being given to these glass plates. We were probably one of the first people actually to open up the cabinets because it was cloudy out, it was snowing, we were bored, we didn't have anything else to do. And we said, okay, let's see what we can do with these plates. And so that's essentially what happened. The pre-covery increased the observed orbit from 27% to 36%, 8% below the ecliptic. Now, why was this important? At that time, the Pluto Kuiper Express mission, which never happened, the mission was killed because it got too expensive, was destined to be launched in 2010. But at that time, there were 2 spacecraft. One was to be launched, another one was then to follow it, much like the 2 Voyagers. And it had to reach Pluto by 2020. And the reason why it had to reach 2020, because the nitrogen atmosphere was outgassing, and they wanted to look at the nitrogen atmosphere. If they waited longer, it would then refreeze and be no nitrogen in the air and be solid ice on Pluto's surface. And we're gonna have another opportunity for another 200 years. JPL got interested because of the navigational errors. So Dr. Miles Standish, who was head of navigation for JPL, got really interested in this. And through the University of Chicago, so he was one of the individuals who helped validate that this was real. And you can go look on Wikipedia and a couple other places. Be happy to send references as to where they actually established it and where Miles Standish has his name on this work as well. But the Pluto ephemeris had an error of 10,000 kilometers per 10 years. So if you're going to send two spacecraft at 17 kilometers per second at 15,000 kilometer altitude, one minor error would doom the mission, at least for one spacecraft. And so and the reason for two is because it was flying past Pluto so fast that they couldn't photograph all of Pluto. So one spacecraft would cross quickly, followed by another to photograph the rest of Pluto. And that's what the plan was. But it got too expensive. PKE mission was killed, and thus that led to the New Horizons, which was one spacecraft. However, what happened then too was the work became so important that Yerkes, the University of Chicago, actually received a grant to begin digitizing thousands of glass plates for data preservation, and that work goes on today. In fact, during the shutdown, that was the only work that was going on at university at the Yerkes Observatory. So what happened was, so this is the revitalization of Yerkes. One slide. I have a much larger talk, which gives them the history of Yerkes. But Yerkes declined from 2005 to 2021. UFC announced in March of 2005 that it was going to sell Yerkes and its property, and there were a lot of people that wanted that property. 50 acres of the most prestigious land overlooking Lake Geneva that you could possibly imagine. People were salivating on the possibility of golf courses and resorts, and it was quite sad, actually. The sale never materialized because the astronomy community at large and the local community of Lake Geneva, even though they were forsaking a great deal of potential revenue by turning the property over to as resorts and golf courses, they didn't want it. They wanted to preserve Yerkes, and so the UFC announced in March 2018 that it was going to cease operations October 1st of 2018. Thus, Yerkes closed from 2018 to 2021. But its glass plate work remained open. So the only area of the Yerkes that was still open was the glass plate archival work, because you couldn't move the glass plates. So you had to do all the work there. Yerkes Future Foundation was established. They took ownership May 1st, 2020. Dennis Coy was then appointed Yerkes director in 2021. And then they started a campaign to raise $25 million. And as of last month, I think they're up to, I think they're up to about 17 million. They began Yerkes tours May 27, 2002, and I was there last week of June to talk to them and talk about this work and about what they were planning. And Amanda Bauer, Dr. Amanda Bauer, just joined them on July 5th, day after 4th of July, as the director and head of science and education for Yerkes. She was the deputy director of operations at the Vera C. Rubin Observatory, which is the new observatory that's being built in Chile, and that's the one that has the largest CMOS camera, I believe, on the planet. It's, several tons and as big as a Volkswagen, I guess. But she was the deputy director, and she decided to lead the efforts at Yerkes Observatory. And that, I think I'm slightly over my time. Any quick questions?
Okay, well, I'm going to sort of unilaterally suggest that we move on. We have another guest speaker, Lisa Ann Fanning. And her talk is on astronomical events and bird behavior. Many people are familiar with the effects of solar eclipses on animal behavior. But what about the stars or moon phases or other such astral world? How is migration of these? And she'll have some interesting case studies. A little bit about our guest speaker. Lisa Ann Fanning was born and raised in New York City, has always had a curiosity for the natural world, which is a passion she carries with her always. She's a longtime member and volunteer for Monmouth County Audubon and various other conservation organizations across New Jersey. She's also an amateur astronomer, recipient of the Explore the Moon and Explore the Universe Observing certificates from the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, editor of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada's Halifax Center's Nova Notes newsletter, and creator of Lisa's Lookup on Facebook. She's also an active member of our club, the AAAP. Lisa,
Thank you so much.
Presenting to us today.
Thank you. All right. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Great. Let's make that bigger then. All
There you
right.
go.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about astronomical events and bird behavior, as was mentioned. This was a project that became that came to as a result of marrying two of my passions. I'm only recently arrived at astronomy, mostly a product of the pandemic, although it predates it a little bit. I have Lyme disease, and the story was that I was taking doxycycline, could not do the things that I love, such as hiking and going out and going birding, and was very bummed about it, dealing with the blues. My husband said, let's take the spotting scope out and let's take a look at Jupiter and Saturn. And I think a lot of people have that same story about seeing Saturn's rings for the first time, or Jupiter's moons, and becoming hooked. I then purchased, I went on Amazon and I purchased 2 books by John Reed, 50 Things to See on the Moon and 50 Things to See with a Telescope, and decided that I just needed more information. I reached out to John Reed, and he is a member of RASC, which is the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. And he happened to be teaching during the pandemic. He was co-teaching the Explore the Universe program virtually. So he said, well, why don't you join? You don't have to be a member. And I was so impressed with the program that I ended up joining RASC. So that's my connection to Halifax, Nova Scotia, even though I have only been there once in my life. So I mentioned that conservation is obviously my number one passion. I've been working in that space for years in a voluntary capacity, working with various organizations across New Jersey, Conserve Wildlife Foundation, helping out New Jersey Fish and Wildlife, helping out Monmouth County Audubon, et cetera, New Jersey Audubon. And so I was in the process of doing my Explore the Moon certificate, and I was out photographing the moon through the scope, through the spotting scope at the time, just a Swarovski 65 millimeter spotting scope. And it was October, and you could hear chip notes of birds migrating up ahead. And sure enough, as I pointed the scope at the moon, at the face of the moon, I could see birds actually passing over the face of the moon. And so I thought, what is the connection here? What is the connection between the phases of the moon and songbird migration? So I started to dig deeper into this, and this is sort of how this project was born. And it's something that I continue to research and try to make connections as far as I can across with birds, with marine mammals, and try to understand what the connection is. So that's how this project was born. And you could see some of the pictures. The picture on the right was as a result of 2 seconds of video, and I extracted the frames and stacked the photos and found 2 birds going across the face of the moon. I thought I was brilliant. I was ready to cash in my millions because I thought I had invented some newfangled way to find search out migration, but I come to find out that George Lowry and Robert Newman discovered this process in the 1940s and 1960s. Through the 1960s, they described the ability to point a telescope at the illuminated disk of the moon and to see birds migrating at night. So so much for my fame. It was very short-lived. So this is a video that I took. So just don't blink. That's what you'll see if you point a scope at the face of the moon. Now, if you want to try this at home, I'm just going to play it one more time. If you want to try this at home, you want to do it during heavy migration periods, which in New Jersey would be May, or the heaviest. That's the peak for spring migration, for northbound migration, and for southbound migration, end of September through October would be peak. So, hit those full moons. What you want to do is you want to time it with the winds. So you want winds from the south for northbound migration and winds from the north with a northerly component for southbound migration. So, this week we had the full moon, but unfortunately, we didn't have the right component of winds. So it wasn't a heavy migration night the other night. So I started to dig deeper into this to see what work has been done. And there was a study done out of Lund University in Sweden. And sure enough, it was the first study of its kind to find that the lunar cycle drives migration of a nocturnal bird. Now, they looked at the European nightjar, which is relative to our whippoorwill here in North America. And, of course, they found that when there were more heavily moonlit nights, that hunting activity for flying insects, the birds were more active. So that certainly makes sense. But what came out of the study, which was even more interesting, is the fact that the birds departed for southbound autumn migration consistently 10 to 11 days after the full moon for this particular species. And they found that individual birds all synchronized this flight and flew off at the same time. So pretty amazing stuff. NexRad is the Next Generation Radar. This is a consortium between Cornell Lab of Ornithology, NASA's involved in this. There are several organizations that are involved in this. And what they do is, during the heavy migration periods that I described earlier, they actually track the concentrations of migrating birds, and they have these real-time radar maps that you can go to. So what you want to do is Google Birdcast, and it will show these live migration maps. And you can see the concentrations, and it does these predictions based on the radar for migrating birds, bats, and insects. And I took a look at some of the moon data. So here's a full moon. This was last September 21st, a full moon versus a new moon of October 6th of 2021. And you could see, in this case, the full moon on the left, the central flyway was completely lit up. So there was very, very heavy migration. So this is looking at exactly the same time. So under that full moon, you had almost 732 million birds that were in flight. Versus the new moon, you only had 185 million birds in flight. So, definitely something to explore a little further. So I extracted that data and even further and decided to chart it. And you can see the peaks and valleys here. You can see that there are peaks with the full moon, and then around times of the new moon, there are dips. Now, October 6th, I'll point out so there's a little bit of a dip there, but just prior, you could see a little bit of a peak leading into that new moon. Again, I did talk about how winds come into play in this. So we had not ideal winds last fall for migration. So what happens during migration is the birds actually get backed up, and at some point they say, okay, we've got to go, and they wait for the right timing and the right winds, the right conditions, and then they take off. But you could see that they took off while there was still some moonlight, and then there was very little activity around that new moon period. So there are new findings all the time. And recently I was sent an article. We all know about how eclipses, especially solar eclipses, affect animals. But here is a study that was done with lunar eclipses and black swifts. So the theory was that moonlight was directly influencing the bird's nighttime behavior. So whenever the moon is very bright, the black swifts actually fly at higher altitudes. And so a lunar eclipse on January 20th, 2019, they found that the black swifts they rapidly descended from their high altitude of 13,000 feet. And then when that lunar eclipse ended, the swifts returned again to higher altitudes. So again, another example of a direct correlation of how an astronomical event is influencing birds. Here's one of my favorites. This little cutie here on the left is a saw-whet owl. Saw-whet owls are considered a very secretive species. You know, they're tiny bird, one of the smallest birds and one of the smallest owls in North America. And they typically breed in higher elevations. They migrate in the winter. The female birds are the ones who are more likely to wander because the male birds will stay in Canada and points north to just defend their territories, really. So about every 4 years, we get these eruption years where there are higher numbers of these female birds that wander. And they do migrate at night. So there are banding studies that are done, and there's a lot of data around this regarding the correlation between moon illumination, but there are some theories around this. So one theory is that increased moonlight causes greater mist net visibility. Another one is that owl migration is lower during increased moonlight to mitigate the risk of being predated by larger owls. So this tiny little owl that you can see on my arm, just for scale there, barred owls and great horned owls will in fact attack them and eat them. Another theory is that rodents, which are saw-whet prey, are not as active under brighter conditions because they want to avoid being predated. So, you know, animals, birds are not going to move unless there is, you know, some return to that, to expenditure of energy. So this study of saw-whet prey and rodents moving and not moving under brighter conditions was backed up by a study that was done with barn owls. And they found through the dissection of barn owl pellets that the barn owls were not eating when there was a full moon. Again, a direct link to the fact that the rodents were just not active. So here in New Jersey, our local saw-whet owl banding project, there are several different banding stations. I know there's one in Mercer County. The one that I have been very fortunate to help out with is under the leadership of Professor Tom Brown, who's a federally licensed bird bander for songbirds and raptors. If you've ever been to the Sandy Hook during spring or fall migration, you may have seen his banding station. He's a very friendly guy. He will show you the birds if it's not crazy. I mean, some days are completely chaotic at the banding station. I was fortunate enough to receive an invitation many years ago to go out and band saw-whet owls with him and help with that process. It helps to study the patterns of populations here in New Jersey, but more importantly, they input this information into a network, a database across the US and across Canada, where we can extrapolate information about populations. So I asked Professor Brown for his data. He was very generous in giving me his data. He gave me 10 years worth of data. And these 10 years worth of data represent 99 sessions. So it just happened to fall at 99. But so I took that data and I mapped it versus the moon phase. So I was hoping that I would come up and be able to prove the theory that the saw-whets were captured under lower light conditions. And sure enough, if you look at the first two, so the majority were 43% were captured under 0 to 20% lunar illumination. And the second band there, 13% of 21 to 40%. So more than half of the captures were done under low light conditions. Here's another good one that I came across when I was doing this research. In 1967, there was a study about the role that stars play in autumn migration. And they created a simulator for indigo buntings to be able to explore what are they using the patterns of the stars, are they using the stars themselves? And what they found with the indigo buntings was that the birds became disoriented when the researchers would remove constellations within 35 degrees of the North Star. So the birds would hop south in the simulator when the constellations were proper, and they would orient themselves in the direction in which they wanted to fly. When they removed those some of those stars within 35 degrees of the North Star, the birds were disoriented. They didn't know which way to hop. And so the research concluded that it wasn't the individual stars themselves, but it was the rotation of the patterns around the actual North Star being the center point. So some very interesting stuff. And this study goes back to 1967. So here's a pretty timely one, solar activity in birds. So a 2019 study found that migratory birds can be impacted by solar activity and changes that it causes in the Earth's geomagnetic field. What happens is broadband radio frequency noise temporarily prevents some species of birds, particularly European robins have been studied, and it definitely impedes their geomagnetic sense. So this is, I think, something that we in conservation want to, be mindful of right now, since we're early in the 25th solar cycle here. So keeping with that topic, it's not just for the birds. And I wanted to put some other examples in there as well. We talked a little bit about solar eclipses, and here are some examples of, pretty well-known examples, I think, of what solar eclipses do to birds. And birds think it's nighttime and bats start flying around. And so your typical nighttime behaviors of animals will occur when there's a solar eclipse, because the birds become confused. And staying with the full or new moon, this is something that I was aware of from when I was a little girl back growing up in Brooklyn. My father used to take me fishing, and he would always say, don't go fishing on a full or a new moon. So there are two different schools of thought on this. There are people that say that they agree with this completely, that the full and new moon create higher tides, and there's more room for fish to move around, so they don't want to eat. And the people who disagree say that the fish are feeding more actively during a full moon. So what's the right answer? As I started to do this work, I decided to go back and revisit something from my childhood, and find out, is there any truth to this? Well, the real answer is that it depends on the species. So this was a study that was done in New South Wales, Australia, looked at catch data from 145 offshore fishing tournaments versus the moon phase, and examined catch of 14,319 fish. And it depends on the species. So black marlin, for example, the highest catch rates occur during the period between the full moon and the last quarter, for blue sharks during the new moon. So every animal here is wired differently. So some of them are able to withstand, for example, the higher tides and stronger tides. So that's what's driving the data here. This is a good one that I really enjoyed. A friend of mine's, I told her I was doing this project, and she said, do you know about the dung beetles? And, just that sentence alone made me stop and decide to look further into it. So there was a study done with African dung beetles, and it was found that they orient themselves with the sky to move along straight paths. So this was the first study that proved the use of the starry sky for orientation in insects, but also for the use of the Milky Way in orientation in the animal kingdom. And again, this study came out of Lund University in Sweden, our same friends there that did the Nightjar study. And what they did was they constructed an artificial Milky Way using LED lights and found that the variance in the brightness between the different sections of the Milky Way is what the dung beetles were using for navigation. So really interesting stuff. There are just some amazing examples out there of how animals are impacted by astronomical events. This summer, if you're a fan of Shark Week and some of those shark programs, National Geographic actually ran a program called Shark Side of the Moon. And they gave a wonderful example about how full moon triggers the migration of pregnant females of the scalloped hammerhead shark, who they start out in the Galapagos and they travel all the way to Panama for their nursery grounds. And pictured here, I had to include that, but her name is Cassiopeia. And the researcher there is Pelayo Salinas de Leon. And his study actually found that 8 of 10 tagged sharks that they had, these female pregnant sharks, left for their journeys to the nursery grounds on the full moon. So that work does continue. And this was really the first evidence of shark migration sharing a connection with the full moon. Coming back to sunspots, there is a correlation between whale strandings and sunspots. And this is a Duke University study. And the study was published in February of 2020. And they took a look at gray whales because, first of all, they're one of the longest mammal migrations. They migrate up to 10,000 miles. And there is an extensive history of their strandings in a database, as well as the fact that they typically migrate, near shore. So that also, leads to a higher risk of stranding. And what this study found was that gray whales were stranding more often on days with increased level of atmospheric radio frequency noise. So, again, something to keep in mind. I think we heard of some strandings this year with humpback whales. This particular study that focused on gray whales, that team is now looking at other whale species. So definitely something to keep an eye on as we move through this solar cycle. Staying with the theme of solar activity, this is the list of animals that scientists believe use magnetic field for navigation. So again, let's take a look at that correlation. It would be really interesting to see. Now, I've reached out to the University of Florida research team there to try to get some of their shark data, because I would like to try to dissect that data for myself and try to correlate it with some of the solar activity that's taking place, especially now. All right, so people always talk about full moon and humans, right? Supposedly there is no connection, there's no data connection, but I think if you talk to anybody who works either in the medical field or as a first responder, they'll tell you that that's just not true. The full moon definitely does have a correlation on humans. I could tell you from my own personal health issues with Lyme disease, there is definitely something that I feel. For me, it's around the new moon. Other friends that I have that are battling Lyme disease feel it around the full moon. So, parasites are more active around the full moon. And the reason for that is that many parasites are actually attracted to increased serotonin, which occurs in humans around the full moon. The other side effect is that there's lower sleep efficiency because of decreased melatonin. And there was a 2014 light-controlled study that was published in Sleep Medicine that actually looked at that. So they took the factor of increased light out of it and just studied specifically the moon and how it affects sleep, and found that that there is an interruption of sleep around full moons. And finally, full moon frolic. The Great Barrier Reef is another wonderful example of how a full moon actually triggers a coral spawn, which leads to a whole wonderful cycle of spawning for the corals, the clams, the sea cucumbers, and starfish. So this is triggered the night before the full moon, and when the ocean temperature reaches just above 26 degrees Celsius with the correct tidal flow. So again, the full moon comes into play here as well. So I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity as I continue down this journey to make these connections. I'm happy to share what I find. I'm really interested, especially in trying to track down that shark data. So if anybody has any connections, I definitely welcome you to reach out to me. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Lisa. Thanks very much. Any questions for either Lisa or Michael at this point? Tom Swords, I thought I would give you a shout out and see if you have any evidence either way about fish responding to the full moon.
No.
All right, well, you're no help.
I was thinking the same thing, Victor. I'm glad.
Okay.
There
I
are
have a
these
question
tables.
for our speaker, for Lisa.
Okay.
Hi, Lisa. So my question is, you got some really nicely timed images of birds flying across the face of the moon with your video timing and everything. Have you gone back and thought about maybe you could calculate their altitude by triangulation based on the data you have available to you? I think you could do it.
Yeah, definitely. This was something that I came across while I was just looking for features on the moon and grabbed some quick shots. And this is definitely work that I want to continue with. You're coming up on October, so the heavy migration season here in New Jersey, and definitely looking to do some of that work. And if I could also try to figure out the species, sometimes you can by chip note, believe it or not. But that's that might be a little bit over my head, but I'd like to try to figure that out as well.
Cool. Very beautiful.
Yeah, Lisa, last weekend this is the heavy migration season over the Atlantic Skyway. I think Cape May is a good place to go for watching these birds. I did last weekend, and it was just amazing. The variety of birds that are in those marshlands.
I was there as well. I was photographing the full moon. We probably crossed paths.
Oh, must have. But it's a fascinating lecture. Amazing.
Thank you so much.
Lisa,
I
I'm Prasad.
enjoyed it. And I
I'm
enjoyed
Prasad.
Dr. Mario too.
Yeah, go ahead, Prasad.
Yeah, Lisa, thanks a lot. Excellent lecture. A lot of excellent correlations you have pointed out. Are there any studies like linking full moon to lunatic activity, like mental illnesses or something amongst people when the moon is full?
I really tried to dig up the data, and they're saying that there's no correlation, but anecdotally, if you talk to anybody who works in law enforcement, and I don't know if folks watch that, there's one of those live PD shows that are on, they all weekend long, that's what they were talking about. It was such a crazy night. With a lot of their cases, their departments were all very busy, and they kept coming back to the fact that it's a full moon, and this always happens on the full moon. So anecdotally, you do hear it, but the data just doesn't support it enough to, to call it a definite correlation. I think it does. I mean, I know it can affect me. Not that.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have a question for Michael.
if I could.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, okay, a question. You, early on, you said that, that Charon, they thought Charon was split off from Pluto. What is the evidence for that?
That came from the New Horizons study. So I got that data I got from NASA, some NASA website. I don't know. I don't know through spectral reading. I don't know how they actually determined that.
I was just curious what the mechanism is. I mean, maybe they,
I'm not aware of how they determined that.
thank you. And I have a question for Lisa, just a really quick one. So how long do you have to watch the moon to see some birds fly across it typically? Yeah.
So again, that picture with the two birds crossing, that occurred in 2 seconds. That was from 2 seconds of extracted video. I like to stand out there for at least an hour and try to count. Now my husband is a bird watcher as well, so he's actually a park naturalist for the Monmouth County Park System. So we actually rely on that to figure out what kind of day he's going to have the next day, leading his bird walks for folks, to figure out volumes. Now, some of them do keep going, but other species will put down if they hit weather, for example, they'll hit a wall of clouds. But within 15 minutes, you should see quite a few, I would say. Again, make sure that you're timing it when the winds are right. So in the fall, you want that northerly component of winds to help push them south.
What about the position of the moon, Lisa? I mean, if it's high or low, or it's a fairly narrow angle you're looking at. Does it matter where in the sky the moon is?
As long as the increased light is there, it seems to help the birds, want to take off. It seems to trigger that event of, hey, it's time to go. I mean, I've certainly pulled all-nighters, and seen birds flying all throughout the night. If you step outside on a night, you can even just listen and hear chip notes and just the sweetest little chips up above, and the birds are moving. So it doesn't really matter. It's more the amount of light that's helping them.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have a question for Dr. Mario. Do you know how many objects have been pre-covered?
For Pluto?
Well, I guess just in general.
I don't know that, but I think I can look it up though. There is if you look at pre-covery in Wikipedia, there is someone I think who's tabulated that. So I think it's a few hundred. But I think pre-covery Wikipedia, I think it's got a full listing, including this one, these two.
And if you're in the chat, Bob Vanderby, one of our members, has shared a image that he took of what he believes a bird crossing the moon. So go into chat.
Sure looks good for it.
Oh, that's a beautiful image. Go, Bob. Yeah, that's
That is fantastic.
Too bad I didn't get several across the.
There's always something to aspire to in this hobby.
okay. Now that is not a cell phone video.
No.
There's some work that went into that. Okay. Okay, any other questions for either of our guest speakers?
I just thought of one. Lisa, I know you showed the NexRad images. Has there been any? I know about the monarch butterfly. Do you know if they look that up or they can image that on their radar?
So NextRad actually does capture birds, bats, and insects as a whole as well.
Okay.
So insects, if there are mass migrations, there was that mass migration several years ago down in Cape May of the monarchs, where they all got held up by bad winds and they didn't cross the Delaware Bay. When they took off the next morning, that actually showed up on the radar.
Cool.
Yep.
Elisa, I just want to ask you in general, there's been a lot written and spoken lately about sort of the demise of the natural world and how we're impacting poorly on, species we'd like to keep around. What do you have a general attitude of optimism or otherwise that about having birds around for the long term?
I think that's a whole other hour of of conversation. It's a little, I have obviously through this work, I have a lot of friends up in Canada, and all I'm hearing about is the bird flu and how it's impacting a lot of the seabird colonies up there. It's a little hard to be optimistic in that sense. I mean, I want to believe that we can turn this around. So, I hope we can. But there's just, it seems like every time you turn around, there's just more and more bad news.
Okay, well, anyone would like to ask a more optimistic question? I
Sorry.
don't want to end there. So,
like I said, that could be a whole other hour in itself. I mean, other species thrive. When some species leave, other species thrive. So, I think we see examples of that. We're seeing birds like limpkins that were historically in Florida, and now they're wandering to places like Kansas. It's white ibis was unheard of in New Jersey. Now there's a breeding colony down in South Jersey. So, something always flourishes when something else gives.
Yeah, brown pelicans are flourishing somewhere else.
That's right.
Yeah, but most of them are threatened. I mean, a lot of the migratory birds, because, light pollution actually disorients them. And I wanted to know if there are any studies being conducted on population decreases due to, such disorientation.
Yeah, that's actually another talk that I've given in the past. I mean, light pollution certainly impacts millions of birds every year when they do things like they're migrating and they hit buildings because they become disoriented from light pollution. I mean, even with please fact check this, but I think it's like 16,000 birds per night are impacted when we put the lights on for the Twin Towers tribute. Nobody is suggesting stopping that tribute, but there's definitely a lot of studies taking place around that event to understand how we can try to mitigate that. So every little thing really does impact them. You wouldn't think that putting 2 lights on for a light tribute would impact that many birds, but it does. Very, very good point about light pollution.
okay, any last questions before we head off to a little bio break here?
Yeah, may I just say on behalf of the club that you too have brought a dimension of astronomy to us tonight that goes way off the typical track, and it was absolutely fascinating and wonderful to hear both of you deeply immersing yourselves into the science and the art of it. So we really, really appreciate bringing the perspectives you brought tonight. So thanks for sharing some time, and we'll talk again in the future. So thanks to both of you.